The deep, ancient hush of the Pacific Northwest wilderness was often broken by the cacophony of nature, the shriek of a hawk, the rustle of deer through underbrush, the distant roar of a mountain lion. But lately, a different kind of sound had begun to permeate the dense canopy, something unsettling and unknown. A low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the very earth, followed by snapping branches far larger than any deer could manage. Whispers traveled through the sparse logging towns, tales of strange tracks found near secluded creeks, prints unlike any known animal, impossibly large and distinctly human-like in their proportion. They spoke of a presence, an ancient entity stirring from its slumber, hinting at something primeval that defied modern understanding, a creature woven into the very fabric of the land since time immemorial. The forest, usually a source of comfort and solitude, now held an undercurrent of unease, a silent warning to those who ventured too deep. John, a man carved from the same rugged landscape he patrolled, felt this shift with a keen, almost instinctual awareness. His late 50s had etched lines of experience around his clear, observant eyes that had seen too much sorrow, yet still held an unwavering dedication to the wild. He was a park ranger, yes, but more accurately, he was the forest's keeper, its silent guardian. After the sudden, devastating loss of his wife years ago, he'd retreated to the edges of civilization, finding solace in the rhythmic predictability of nature and the demanding solitude of his work. His small, weathered cabin, nestled on the very fringe of the sprawling national park, was more than just a home. It was a sanctuary, a testament to a life lived deliberately, away from the bustling world he no longer understood. His only confidant, a grizzled, loyal German shepherd named Bear, was usually at his heels, a constant, comforting presence against the vast emptiness of his days. Bear, with his keen senses and unwavering loyalty, was more than a pet. He was family, the last remaining link to a life that once was. One crisp autumn morning, the familiar routine of his patrol took an unexpected turn. Following a faint game trail along the glacial meltwater stream, Bear suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his chest. His hackles rose, a primal warning John had learned to trust implicitly. John scanned the dense forest ahead, his hand instinctively going to the bear spray on his belt, his gaze missing nothing. Then he saw it. Not immediately obvious to an untrained eye, but glaringly so to a man who lived and breathed the wilderness. A recently abandoned campsite lay before him, a haphazard collection of burnt-out embers and discarded wrappers. But it wasn't the human detritus that caught his attention. It was the ground around it, interspersed with the smaller, more mundane boot prints of the campers, were colossal depressions, disturbingly clear in the damp earth. They were undeniably bipedal, but the sheer size sent a shiver down John's spine. Each print measured an astounding 17 inches, with a width to match revealing a splayed, powerful foot. These weren't bear prints. Bears dragged their paws, and these showed a distinct heel and well-defined toes, not claw marks. They were too large to be human, too well-formed to be anything John had ever officially documented in the vast catalog of North American wildlife. A few yards away, near the remnants of a hastily dismantled tent, John discovered a scene that solidified the strangeness of the prints. The carcass of a large deer lay twisted against a fallen log, its neck snapped with brutal force. But it wasn't just the killing that was unusual. It was the way the kill had been handled. There were no signs of a typical predator tearing at the flesh. Instead, Large, almost surgical portions of muscle had been removed, leaving clean, precise cuts. The ground around the deer was churned, indicating a struggle. But what struck John was the sheer power implied by the scene. Whatever had done this was immensely strong, quick, and precise. It felt territorial, a warning, yet also something else. A crude, instinctual act born of desperation, perhaps, rather than pure predatory instinct. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the unsettling scent of something wild and untamed, far beyond the familiar musk of bear or cougar. John knelt, examining the prints once more, tracing the outline of a massive toe with his gloved finger. The sheer scale of the creature that had left these tracks was staggering, almost unbelievable. It defied all rational explanation, yet here was the undeniable evidence staring back at him from the forest floor. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs, not with fear, but with a profound sense of awe and a burgeoning curiosity that pushed through his usual stoicism. This was something new, something ancient, something that had slipped through the cracks of modern science and remained a whispered legend. His years of patrolling these woods had taught him to dismiss the sensational and focus on the practical. Yet these prints, this disturbed campsite, this powerful, unusual kill, pointed to something far beyond the realm of ordinary wildlife. This wasn't just another predator. This was an anomaly, an enigma that had left its indelible mark on his familiar world. The wilderness, he realized, still held secrets, deep and profound, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to challenge everything he thought he knew. A new purpose, unsettling yet compelling, began to unfurl within him. He secured the area, marking the prints with small flags for later detailed investigation. But he knew in his gut that this was not a typical case for the wildlife department. It was something far more significant, far more mysterious. The forest had called to him again, this time with a riddle etched in the earth. If you're as drawn into the mysteries of the wild as John is, and you crave more captivating stories from the unknown, please subscribe to our channel. Join our community as we delve deeper into the unexplained phenomena that lurk at the edges of our world. Your subscription helps us bring more compelling tales like this one to light. The unsettling tranquility of the wilderness had begun to fray around the edges, mirroring the slow erosion of John's personal peace. What started as peculiar anomalies quickly escalated into a series of grim discoveries that sent a shiver down his spine, a premonition of something ancient stirring from the depths of the forest. More animal carcasses were appearing, scattered throughout the deeper woods, their remains telling a silent, brutal story. It wasn't the work of a typical predator. The wounds were too precise, too devastating, yet strangely methodical. A bear would leave a mess. A wolf pack would strip an animal clean. These killings were different, almost clinical in their efficiency, yet imbued with an underlying ferocity that spoke of immense power. John's loyal companion, a grizzled old Labrador mix named Rusty, became an unwitting barometer of the escalating tension. Normally placid and observant, Rusty now bristled during their patrols, his hackles rising, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his chest at nothing John could see or hear. His keen nose twitched frantically, pulling at his leash, always orienting towards the denser, untouched sections of the forest where the canopy grew thick and sunlight struggled to penetrate. John often paused, scanning the tree line, feeling an unseen presence, a heavy gaze that tracked their movements from the shadows. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a primal energy, an unspoken warning that something extraordinary and potentially dangerous now shared their domain. The growing suspicion that had been a whisper in John's mind now solidified into a stark, undeniable truth. Bigfoot. The evidence, though circumstantial, was mounting. Beyond the unusual animal casualties, he started finding other signs. Broken saplings, snapped with impossible force, far too high for a bear to reach. Patches of matted ground, far larger than any deer bed, hinting at an enormous creature resting. And then the smell. A musky, earthy scent like damp fur and wild greens, faint but distinct, different from any animal he knew. It was a smell that brought an unsettling mix of awe and trepidation. Yet, as he pieced together these perplexing clues, a different narrative began to emerge, one that contradicted the image of a mindless monster. The very precision of the killings, while terrifying, also suggested a creature honing its skills out of necessity, perhaps weakened or injured. He noticed that some of the carcasses, particularly a large elk, showed signs of scavenged medicinal herbs nearby, almost as if the animal had been attempting to self-medicate its own wounds while feeding. It was a bizarre, almost humanistic detail that sparked a new thought in John's mind. What if this wasn't just a predator, but a creature in distress? This idea took root after John discovered a series of broken branches and trampled undergrowth, leading away from a kill site. Not in a direct path of retreat, but with a slight, almost imperceptible drag. Following these subtle indicators, he found a patch of disturbed earth where a viscous, dark fluid had seeped into the soil. It wasn't blood from the prey. It was thicker, darker, and had a metallic tang that spoke of internal injury. Nearby, he found a crudely fashioned splint, made from intertwined vines and bark, discarded and ineffective, suggesting a failed attempt at injury management. This wasn't the trail of an apex predator terrorizing its territory for sport. This was the struggle of a wounded, desperate being. A growing sense of empathy began to eclipse his initial fear. John, a man haunted by his own past sorrows, recognized the silent language of suffering. He saw not a monster, but a powerful ancient being, wounded and cornered, perhaps lashing out of pain and fear. The wilderness, he knew, could be a brutal healer, but sometimes a gentler hand was needed. He resolved to find the source of the disturbances, no longer with an intent to deter or even merely understand, but with a burgeoning desire to offer solace. The first attempts were hesitant, almost ritualistic. John began leaving small offerings near the areas where Rusty had shown the most agitation, or where he'd found fresh tracks indicating a large presence. He started with edible berries gathered from his garden, then moved to dried fruit and nuts, placed carefully on smooth, flat stones, away from the usual paths. He avoided meat, not wanting to reinforce any predatory habits, but focused on nourishing, easily digestible items. Alongside these, he included bundles of wild sage and other medicinal herbs known for their analgesic and antiseptic properties, hoping instinct would guide the creature to their healing powers. Each morning he would return, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation, to find the offerings gone. Sometimes the stones would be slightly shifted, a faint imprint left on the soft earth. The consumption was always clean, methodical, never a messy scatter. This reinforced his growing belief. This was not a mindless beast. This was an intelligent, suffering entity. He started expanding his offerings, sometimes leaving a small, clean pail of fresh water. He even included a small, hand-carved wooden bird, a gesture of peace and an acknowledgement of the creature's hidden sentience. He spoke softly to the empty air, explaining his intentions, hoping that somehow, some way, his words carried beyond the rustling leaves and into the understanding of the forest's unseen inhabitant. He knew the risks were immense, that he was venturing into the unknown, but the conviction that he was helping a gravely injured creature outweighed all caution. He was a guardian, not just of the park, but of all its vulnerable denizens, seen and unseen. John watched from a concealed vantage point, the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, barely illuminating the scene below. His binoculars were fixed on the hulking form of the Bigfoot, whose movements were slow, deliberate, and clearly pained. The creature favored its left leg, a deep, ragged wound, marring the otherwise pristine coat of dark, coarse fur on its thigh. It moved with a profound weariness, a weariness that spoke not just of physical injury, but of something deeper, an emotional burden that pressed down on its massive shoulders. He saw it meticulously gather specific leaves and mud, carefully applying them to the open wound. This wasn't just an animal instinct. There was an intelligence, an almost ritualistic care in its self-treatment. The Bigfoot, which John had begun to silently refer to as Kale, in a quiet acknowledgement of its individual existence, would often pause, its large head tilting slightly, as if listening to the whispers of the wind, or perhaps the echoes of its own solitude. There was an undeniable sense of profound loneliness emanating from Kyle, a palpable aura of isolation that tugged at something deep within John. He imagined the creature, so powerful, yet so vulnerable in its wounded state, navigating this vast wilderness entirely alone, its suffering unseen, its pain unshared. The raw, guttural grunts and whimpers that occasionally escaped Kale's throat were not just sounds of physical discomfort. They were laments, the sound of a solitary being grappling with its own mortality in a world that seemed to hold little solace. John felt a burgeoning empathy, a connection forming despite the immense chasm of species and experience. He saw himself, too, secluded in the wilderness after his own loss, and in Kale's solitude, he recognized a shared burden. The decision solidified within John, a quiet resolve hardening his features. He couldn't merely observe any longer. Kyle needed more than wild herbs. He needed targeted, potent medicine, the kind only humans possessed. It was a risky proposition, one that went against every protocol and every instinct of self-preservation ingrained in a wilderness ranger. Approaching an injured, potentially dangerous cryptid was illogical, foolhardy even. Yet, the image of Kale's suffering, the profound loneliness in its eyes, overshadowed all rational fear. John returned to his cabin with a new purpose. He carefully selected a strong antiseptic, bandages, and a powerful painkiller, along with a larger offering of dried fruit, nuts, and a venison jerky he'd prepared. These weren't just offerings. They were overtures, an extension of trust. Over the next few days, John began a meticulous, patient ritual. He would approach Kale's known den area, never getting too close, always announcing his presence with soft, calming words, even though he knew the creature wouldn't understand them linguistically. He would leave the provisions and medicines at the edge of a clearing, always in the same spot, then retreat to a safe distance, watching. The first few times Kale was wary, its massive frame tensing, its eyes tracking John's every move with an unnerving intensity. But the pain, John surmised, eventually outweighed its suspicion. Kyle would tentatively approach after John had left, sniffing the air, examining the strange items. John witnessed the creature's curiosity, the careful way it prodded the unfamiliar objects with a powerful, yet delicate finger. He saw Cale gingerly pick up the antiseptic bottle, turning it over in its huge hands before eventually, and to John's immense relief, pouring some onto its wound. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The painkiller, John hoped, would provide some much-needed respite, allowing Cale to rest and truly begin to heal. Weeks turned into a careful, almost silent ballet of trust-building. John continued his daily pilgrimages, each time leaving more supplies, sometimes adding new items like thick blankets or even a small, crude drawing on birch bark, an attempt at communication across the species divide. Cale, in turn, slowly but surely began to tolerate John's presence. The tensing of its muscles lessened. The cautious retreating became less immediate. One afternoon, John found Kyle resting near the drop-off point, its eyes closed, its breathing deep and even. He approached slowly, speaking in a low, soothing tone. Kyle's eyes fluttered open, observing him without alarm. It was an unspoken acceptance, a fragile bridge built between two solitary beings. As Cale's physical wounds began to mend, John noticed other wounds, deeper ones, etched into its very being. There was a pervasive skittishness, a tendency to flinch at sudden sounds or movements that seemed disproportionate to the current peaceful environment. He often saw Cale meticulously inspecting its surroundings, its gaze lingering on certain areas of the forest floor, as if searching for something, or perhaps remembering something traumatic. On several occasions, as John watched, Kyle would emit a low, mournful sound, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated with an ancient sorrow. It was a sound that spoke of past suffering, of a pain that went beyond the physical injury John was helping to heal. John started to notice distinct patterns in Cale's behavior. Certain clearings it would avoid, specific types of trees it would never sleep under, a general aversion to anything that seemed out of place or recently disturbed. These weren't just quirks, they were the scars of past trauma, behavioral adaptations born from fear and profound hurt. The creature was healing physically, its gait becoming surer, its fur regaining its luster, but the psychological implications of its past torment were still profoundly evident. John knew there was a story etched into Cale's very existence, a narrative of pain and survival that he was only just beginning to decipher. He was no longer just a ranger helping an injured animal. He was a silent confidant, an unintentional witness to a creature's deep-seated sorrow. John's dedication deepened with each passing day, his quiet observations revealing more than he could have ever anticipated. He meticulously documented Cale's behavior, drawing maps of its preferred routes and forbidden zones, noting every subtle shift in its demeanor. It became clear that Cale's avoidance patterns weren't random. They pointed to specific territories, places where danger had once lurked. One day, while tracking Cale's hesitant retreat from a particular grove of ancient pines, John stumbled upon something that sent a chill down his spine. A rusted, severely corroded jaw trap, half buried beneath years of fallen leaves and pine needles. It was massive, far larger than anything legal, designed not for wildlife, but for big game, or perhaps something even larger. The sight of it solidified a terrifying suspicion that had been forming in his mind. This wasn't merely an injured animal. This was a victim of deliberate cruelty. He examined the trap with a knot in his stomach, imagining the immense force required to spring it, the agonizing pain it would inflict. The metal was old, but the design was unmistakable. Nearby, partially hidden by moss, he found a few spent bullet casings, their brass dulled by time, but undeniably from a large caliber rifle. The discovery was like a punch to the gut. Kyle's profound fear of humans, its skittishness, its deep-seated trauma. It all suddenly made terrible, heartbreaking sense. These weren't the remnants of a centuries-old incident. The rust on the trap, while significant, indicated decades, not centuries. This was relatively recent history for a creature that could potentially live for a very long time. John began to revisit the areas Cale meticulously avoided, searching with renewed purpose. He looked for anything that seemed out of place, anything that hinted at a human presence in those long-forgotten corners of the forest. The forest, once a place of quiet contemplation for him, now felt haunted by invisible perpetrators. His search led him to a small, secluded ravine, barely visible from any trail, its entrance choked with thorny bushes and fallen trees. Cale had always veered far off its path to avoid this particular spot. Pushing through the dense undergrowth, John descended into the ravine, the air growing heavy and damp. The ground underfoot was soft, almost bog-like in places. And then he saw it, a vast, nearly invisible pit, carefully concealed with branches and leaves, now partially collapsed, but still discernible. This wasn't a natural formation. This was a man-made death trap, an ancient, cruel design dating back to frontier days, but with clear signs of more recent maintenance. The decaying remnants of human-made snares, thick ropes braided with wire, lay tangled at the bottom, some still partially intact. The pit itself was lined with sharpened stakes, now mostly rotted and broken, but their purpose was abundantly clear: to impale anything unfortunate enough to fall in. A wave of nausea washed over John. He knelt, his hand trembling, as he touched a piece of the weathered rope. This was no accident, no chance encounter with a hunter. This was a deliberate, premeditated act of violence. The injury Cale sustained, the one John had been so carefully tending, had been inflicted by these very devices, or others like them. The wound on Cale's leg, so severe, so deep, it was the signature of a snare, or perhaps a fall into such a pit, followed by a frantic struggle to escape. The bullet casings he'd found nearby were not for a clean kill, but for a lingering, painful one. Or perhaps to drive the creature into these very traps. John imagined the terror, the desperation of Cale trapped, wounded, stalked. The image was agonizing. A profound sense of anger began to simmer within John, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to fully acknowledge since the tragedy that had driven him to this reclusive life. This wasn't just about Cale anymore. It was about the callous disregard for life, the brutal exploitation of this wilderness he had sworn to protect. He spent hours in that ravine, meticulously documenting every detail, sketching the pit, photographing the decaying snares. He found faint, almost imperceptible boot prints, partially preserved in the damp soil, larger than his own but unmistakably human. The evidence was irrefutable. Kyle's suffering was not an act of nature, but a scar left by humanity's darkest impulses. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the ravine, John made his way back, a new resolve hardening his features. He looked towards Cale's territory, now seeing the massive creature not just as a patient, but as a living testament to human cruelty. The bond they had forged, initially one of caretaker and recipient, now transformed into something deeper, a shared understanding of pain and survival. John vowed, with a fierce determination he hadn't felt in years, that he would not only protect Cale, but that he would also uncover who was responsible for its suffering. He would find them, expose them, and ensure that no other creature, least of all Cale, would ever endure such torment again. This was no longer just about healing. It was about justice. His solitary mission had just taken on a perilous new dimension, one that would force him to confront the very darkness he had sought to escape in the solitude of the forest. The quiet ranger had found a new purpose, forged in empathy and a burning desire for retribution. The profound realization that Cale's suffering stemmed from human cruelty ignited a fierce resolve within John. His mission shifted from merely healing a wild creature to seeking justice for it, to uncovering the perpetrators of such a heinous act. He began his investigation subtly, almost imperceptibly, folding it into his routine park patrols. His first step involved a meticulous review of old park records, poring over archived reports of illegal hunting, poaching incidents, and boundary disputes that stretched back decades. The names that consistently reappeared in these dusty files painted a disturbing picture. A particular family, notorious for their recalcitrant attitude towards conservation laws and an almost hereditary disregard for authority, surfaced repeatedly: the Blackwoods. Their name was almost synonymous with illicit activities in the more remote sections of the wilderness, whispered among old-timers with a mixture of fear and grudging respect for their cunning. John cross-referenced these records with local rumors he'd collected over his years as a ranger. Bar talk, hushed conversations in the general store, veiled warnings from seasoned trappers, all pointed towards the Blackwoods' enduring presence and their increasingly brazen encroachment into protected zones. He heard tales of their ruthlessness, their sophisticated traps disguised as natural clearings, their uncanny ability to evade detection, and their outright hostility towards anyone who dared question their activities. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with unsettling clarity. Kyle's profound fear, its avoidance of certain areas, the specific types of injuries it had sustained, they all aligned chillingly with the Blackwood family's known modus operandi. They were known for using older, more brutal trapping methods designed not just to capture, but to inflict lasting damage, methods that spoke of sadism rather than mere survival. His investigation then turned to the physical environment. John systematically expanded his patrol routes, venturing deeper into the less traveled sectors of the forest, areas Cale instinctively avoided. It was here that he began to gather tangible evidence of a more recent, systematic encroachment into Cale's territory. The first sign was subtle. A faint, almost imperceptible line of disturbed underbrush leading away from a familiar game trail. Following it, John soon discovered a series of camera traps, cleverly concealed but unmistakably modern. These weren't the simple, wildlife monitoring devices used by environmental researchers. These were advanced, motion-activated units designed for surveillance, equipped with infrared capabilities. Their placement was strategic, covering choke points and migratory paths that Cale, or any large creature, might use. Further exploration revealed more disturbing findings. He stumbled upon several modified hunting blinds, not the temporary structures used by ethical hunters, but semi-permanent installations, dug into the earth and reinforced with scavenged materials. They were designed for prolonged stakeouts, positioned for maximum visibility over watering holes and feeding grounds. The crude craftsmanship and the lingering scent of stale tobacco and spent gunpowder confirmed his suspicions. This was the work of the Blackwoods. The blinds were equipped with rudimentary comforts, suggesting they spent considerable time observing, waiting. What were they waiting for? The question sent a shiver down John's spine, a cold premonition of danger for Cale. Then came the perimeter markers. Not standard park boundary markers, but odd, almost tribalistic symbols carved into trees, painted onto rocks, or even fashioned from twisted branches and animal bones. These weren't deterrents for other humans. They felt like territorial claims, warnings to Cale that this space was no longer safe, that it was under observation. Some of these markers were quite fresh, indicating a renewed push into the creature's sanctuary. John photographed everything, meticulously documenting coordinates and taking samples where appropriate, building a case that he hoped would be irrefutable. The evidence painted a picture of calculated predatory intent, not just casual poaching. Someone was actively hunting Cale, not for food, but perhaps for something more sinister, more lucrative. As John delved deeper into this grim reality, he began to notice a subtle but worrying shift in Cale's demeanor. The creature, though physically recovering well, seemed to be growing increasingly agitated. Its earlier skittishness had matured into a palpable tension. It was no longer just flinching at sudden noises, but actively scanning the forest with a heightened sense of vigilance. John observed Cale sniffing the air more frequently, its massive head turning slowly from side to side, its eyes narrowed in concentration. The subtle scent of human presence, perhaps the lingering odor of the Blackwood's recent incursions, was clearly disturbing it. Cale would often pause during its foraging, mid-stride, its ears swiveling, its body tensing as if sensing some unseen threat. One afternoon, John witnessed Cale approach one of the newly placed camera traps he hadn't yet removed. The Bigfoot stopped several yards away, its posture rigid, a low growl rumbling deep in its chest. It stared at the device with an intensity that spoke not of fear, but of an awakening ray of recognition, a memory stirring from its traumatic past. It seemed as if Cale, now stronger and more alert, was not only recovering physically, but also becoming more aware of the persistent, encroaching human presence. The very scent of its tormentors, now bolder, closer, and more systematic. The creature's movements became less fluid, more punctuated by abrupt pauses, its gaze darting, as if constantly anticipating an ambush. The peace John had worked so hard to cultivate, the fragile trust he had built, felt increasingly threatened by this renewed human intrusion. Cale was growing restless, its ancient instincts for self-preservation now fully reawakened, fueled by the very presence of those who had caused its initial suffering. The danger was escalating, not just from the poachers, but from the potential for a creature pushed too far to lash out. John knew his time was running out. He had to act, and soon, before Cale was either recaptured or driven to a violent desperation. John's suspicions about Cale's past tormentors began to solidify into grim certainty as he broadened his discreet investigation. He wasn't just looking for clues to Cale's injury anymore. He was searching for the perpetrators, the architects of such profound suffering. His initial inquiries about illegal hunting and poaching led him down a path many locals whispered about, but few dared to openly discuss: the Blackwoods. This family, generations deep in the surrounding valleys, had a notorious reputation. They owned a vast, dilapidated compound several miles deep within the adjacent wilderness, a place shrouded in rumors of illicit game harvesting, unregulated trapping, and a general, arrogant disregard for all conservation laws. Their name, when uttered, usually came with a shiver and a warning glance over the shoulder. John remembered old park records detailing numerous unsolved poaching incidents near their territory, always lacking definitive proof, witnesses too afraid to come forward. There were even older legends, tales of the Blackwood's ancestors setting cruel, indiscriminate traps during leaner times, a practice some hinted still continued in secret. What truly horrified John was the discovery of fresh evidence, indicating that the Blackwoods weren't just a shadowy memory. They were actively encroaching. He found new, more advanced traps, Not just crude snares, but sophisticated steel-jawed contraptions designed to capture large animals alive, or at least immobilize them without mercy. These were no longer the rusty relics he'd found earlier. These were well-maintained instruments of pain, strategically placed along game trails Kyle frequently used. He spotted newly erected, camouflaged hunting blinds, cleverly concealed and positioned to offer a wide, unobstructed view of the forest, often overlooking watering holes or natural clearings. These weren't for deer or elk. They were designed for something much larger, something incredibly rare and valuable. Crude perimeter markers, small, almost invisible flags tied to tree branches, delineated areas the Blackwoods considered their own, pushing further and further into the protected wilderness, into what had become Cale's sanctuary. The scent of human presence, a specific acrid smell he now associated with the Blackwoods, lingered heavily in the air in these newly marked zones, a stark contrast to the natural earthy aroma of Cale's domain. John realized with a sickening lurch that Cal wasn't only recovering physically, but was also becoming acutely aware of this renewed human encroachment. He observed the creature's increased agitation. Cale would often stop dead in its tracks, its massive head raised, nostrils flaring, its eyes scanning the tree line with a palpable sense of unease. The low, mournful sounds he'd heard before returned with greater frequency, often accompanied by a restless pacing, a primal instinct warning of impending danger. John even witnessed Cale carefully dismantling one of the Blackwood's simpler tripwire setups, its powerful fingers deftly untangling the thin wire, its intelligence shining through the veil of wildness. It was clear Cale recognized the insidious threat, and it was becoming increasingly agitated by the lingering scent and tangible presence of its tormentors. The healing process, which had brought Cale a measure of peace, was now being disrupted by the reemergence of past trauma, manifesting as heightened vigilance and a growing, silent fury. Driven by a desperate need to understand the full scope of the Blackwoods' intentions and to protect Kyle, John began to risk closer surveillance of their compound. He spent days hidden in dense brush, meticulously observing their movements, listening to their coarse, guttural conversations carried on the wind. It was during one of these tense stakeouts that he overheard something that chilled him to the bone, confirming his worst fears. Two of the younger Blackwood men, their faces grim and determined, were discussing a bounty, a significant sum of money offered by an unnamed wealthy collector, or perhaps a clandestine research group interested in specimens. They spoke of Kyle not as a creature, but as a prize, a commodity. "It's been spotted near the old logging road again," one drawled, spitting tobacco. "Heard it's gotten bigger, stronger. The injury must have healed up nice. Makes it even more valuable, they say." The other, a brutish man with scarred knuckles, nodded. "Yeah, but it's smarter too, harder to get. Old man Blackwood says we need to step up the game. No more pussyfooting around with snares. We're going in with the big nets, trank darts, and if that don't work..." He trailed off, patting a large, worn rifle slung across his back. They weren't just after sport. They were after Cale itself, alive or dead, to fulfill some nefarious bargain. The conversation hammered home the immediate and mortal danger Cale faced. The Blackwoods were preparing for a systematic, full-scale operation, spurred by greed and a chilling lack of empathy. John felt a surge of cold dread, quickly followed by a burning resolve. He knew he was vastly outnumbered, a lone ranger against a ruthless, well-equipped family. His legal authority was limited to observation and reporting, but the Blackwoods operated outside the law, often silencing anyone who dared to cross them. He couldn't wait for official channels. He had to act, and he had to act fast. His desperation mounted with each passing hour. The image of Kyle, finally healing, now facing an even greater, more organized threat, burning in his mind. He was a single man, deeply embedded in hostile territory, trying to protect a creature few believed existed from a family notorious for violence. The odds were impossibly stacked against him, but the thought of Kale suffering again, or worse, falling into the hands of these cruel men, was unbearable. John knew his next move would determine not only Kale's fate, but possibly his own. The confrontation was no longer a distant possibility. It was an imminent reality, looming large on the horizon. He needed a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan, and he needed it now. The air grew thick with a perverse anticipation, a silence before the storm that vibrated through the ancient trees. John, his heart a drum against his ribs, watched from a precarious perch as the Blackwoods vehicles rumbled into Kale's territory, their headlights cutting harsh, predatory beams through the pre-dawn gloom. This was it. The full-scale operation he had dreaded, meticulously planned, was now unfolding before his eyes. He counted 3 ATVs, a pickup truck, and at least 5 men, all armed, moving with a chilling efficiency. They had brought industrial-grade nets, tranquilizer rifles, and even a drone, its whirring a malevolent hum against the natural chorus of the awakening forest. John had spent the previous night meticulously scouting, setting up his own crude early warning system. Tripwires made of fishing line tied to empty cans, strategically placed around Kale's most frequent paths. He knew he couldn't fight them head-on. They possessed superior firepower and numbers. His only hope was to disrupt their operation, create a diversion, and buy Kale precious time. He clutched his old, trusty hunting rifle, loaded not with bullets, but with specially modified flares and noisemakers. His intention was not to harm, but to disorient and expose. As the Blackwoods fanned out, their voices low and sharp, coordinating their trap, John triggered his first diversion. A loud, piercing whistle, followed by a series of rapid firecrackers he'd rigged to a timed fuse, erupted from an unexpected direction, echoing uncannily through the dense woods. The men froze, startled, their flashlights darting erratically. "What was that?" one snarled, his voice edged with paranoia. "Damn squirrels playing tricks." But the momentary confusion was enough. It gave John a window. He moved silently, a shadow among shadows, circling around their flank. The drone ascended, its camera sweeping the canopy, searching for the source of the noise. John waited until it was directly overhead, then fired a flare, its brilliant red streak arcing upwards, blinding the camera and briefly illuminating the forest in a surreal, fiery glow. The men on the ground shouted, their formation breaking as they squinted against the sudden light. This was his chance. He then aimed his rifle, not at the men, but at the tires of their ATVs, firing the remaining noisemakers, which exploded on impact with a deafening bang, mimicking gunshots. The Blackwoods scattered, convinced they were under attack. "Ambush! We've got company!" Old Man Blackwood roared, dropping to one knee, aiming his high-powered rifle into the darkness. Panic began to ripple through their ranks. This was the turning point John had gambled everything on. The cacophony, the confusion, the sudden brilliant flare. It was all designed to flush Kale out, but not into their nets. Instead, from a patch of dense undergrowth, not far from the disoriented poachers, an impossibly large, dark silhouette emerged. Kale. It moved with a quiet power, a primal force, its massive form now fully healed and radiating an aura of ancient, untamed wilderness. Its eyes, catching the faint glimmers of the moon, and the lingering red glow of the flare burned with an intelligent, almost sorrowful intensity. The Blackwoods, who had bragged about capturing this creature, now stood transfixed, utterly terrified. They had expected a wild animal, yes, but not this. Kyle didn't charge or roar in blind fury. Instead, it moved with a deliberate, almost majestic slowness, directly towards the men who had once tormented it. It paused, its gaze sweeping over each individual, a silent, powerful judgment. The men whimpered, dropping their weapons, paralyzed by a fear far deeper than any they had felt before. This wasn't some beast. This was an entity of profound intelligence, and it had remembered them. Kyle then did something truly astonishing. It looked directly at John, who was still hidden, but now openly visible to the creature. There was no aggression, no warning. Only a fleeting moment of profound understanding passed between them. Then, with a soft, almost mournful rumble that vibrated through the forest floor, Kyle turned its attention back to the Blackwoods. It lowered its immense head, not in preparation for an attack, but in a gesture that was both threatening and strangely restrained. It nudged one of the discarded net guns, then subtly shoved a tranquilizer dart with its foot, revealing the implements of their intention. It was a silent, powerful indictment. John seized the moment. While the Blackwoods were still cowering, their eyes fixated on the colossal figure of Kale, he sprinted towards their truck. With practiced speed, he disabled the ignition, slashed its tires with his hunting knife, and then, using a small, hardened piece of metal he carried for emergencies, he smashed the drone's control panel. He knew this was reckless, exposing himself to immediate danger, but he had to ensure they couldn't escape, couldn't pursue Cal further, and couldn't contact reinforcements. As he worked, two of the Blackwood men, finding their courage, finally noticed him. "There he is! That park ranger!" one shouted, raising his rifle. Without hesitation, John activated his satellite phone, a small, durable device, and punched in the Park Service's emergency code, whispering into it. "Illegal poaching operation. Multiple armed individuals. Endangered species. I'm under fire. Send backup to coordinates." He then hurled the phone deep into the undergrowth, hoping the signal would hold. As the first bullet whizzed past his ear, John dove behind the wrecked pickup truck, drawing their fire, making himself the target. He was a distraction, a shield, buying Cale more time to disappear, and buying the authorities precious minutes to arrive. The confrontation had turned into a desperate, dangerous standoff, and John had willingly placed himself squarely in the path of the storm. The roar of approaching sirens split the pre-dawn silence, a symphony of justice that John had meticulously orchestrated. His distress signal, broadcast through a hastily repaired emergency radio he'd liberated from the Blackwoods camp, had finally cut through the dense forest canopy. Park authorities, augmented by a specialized wildlife enforcement unit, converged on the remote clearing as if sprung from the earth itself. The Blackwoods, caught entirely off guard, stood frozen amidst their illicit equipment: nets, dart guns, modified traps, and enough contraband to fill a small museum of illegal poaching. Their faces, a mixture of disbelief and fury, contorted as uniformed officers swiftly moved in, their commands sharp and authoritative. John watched, a grim satisfaction settling over his weary bones, as each member of the family was systematically disarmed and handcuffed. The patriarch, Old Man Blackwood, eyes blazing with impotent rage, snarled promises of retribution, but his words were hollow, powerless against the weight of the law now bearing down upon them. Cale, having retreated into the deepest shadows during the initial chaos, now stood at the forest's edge, a silent, majestic silhouette against the first blush of dawn. Its eyes, luminous and ancient, met John's across the clearing. There was no explicit communication, no spoken words, but in that shared gaze, John felt a profound, unspoken gratitude emanating from the creature. It was a silent acknowledgement of their bond, a testament to the trust forged in shared adversity. Cale turned then, a flicker of its shaggy form disappearing effortlessly into the dense foliage, leaving John with an indelible image of wild freedom and a heart brimming with quiet triumph. The forest had reclaimed its guardian, and the delicate balance, so violently disrupted, was beginning to mend. In the aftermath, the clearing became a hive of activity. Evidence was catalogued, statements were taken, and the Blackwood's elaborate operation was dismantled piece by piece. John, though exhausted, recounted his harrowing tale to the lead ranger, omitting only the most fantastical details of Cale's intelligence, framing it instead as a protective, territorial animal provoked by illegal activities. He spoke of his discovery of the traps, the bullet casings, and the Blackwood's long history of environmental violations. The sheer volume of illegal equipment and the damning conversations John had overheard were more than enough to secure their apprehension and initiate a thorough investigation. The wildlife unit confirmed the advanced nature of the Blackwood's poaching techniques, noting their intent to capture and exploit rare species, confirming John's worst fears about their true motivations. With the immediate threat neutralized, John returned to his secluded cabin, the forest now feeling lighter, breathing easier. His loyal dog, wagging its tail furiously, greeted him with an enthusiasm that mirrored the newfound peace in John's own heart. The landscape, once shadowed by the lurking threat of human cruelty, now shimmered with an almost mystical serenity. John continued his work as a park ranger, but with a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of the forest and its hidden guardians. He patrolled the trails with a heightened awareness, his senses attuned not just to the visible wildlife, but to the subtle whisper of the wild, the feeling of a presence that was both ancient and ever-present. Cale, though rarely seen, became a silent protector, an almost mythical figure whose occasional, fleeting sightings filled John with a quiet joy. Sometimes John would find a meticulously placed offering near his cabin, a bundle of wild berries, a perfectly preserved fish, small tokens left by a creature that remembered kindness. These silent gifts confirmed that their bond, though unconventional, remained unbroken. John carried the secret of their friendship, a precious burden that deepened his connection to the natural world. He knew he had saved a rare and majestic creature, not just from physical harm, but from the spiritual wound of human malevolence. In doing so, he had also reaffirmed his own purpose, understanding that true conservation extended beyond regulations and patrols. It encompassed empathy, courage, and a deep respect for all life. The story of the Blackwood's downfall and the mysterious protection of the local wildlife spread through the ranger community, though the true extent of John's involvement and Cale's existence remained his closely guarded secret. He had exposed a profound human cruelty, but in doing so, had also found profound hope in the untamed spirit of the wilderness. His life, profoundly altered by his encounter with Cale, became a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring magic of the wild places that still held secrets beyond human comprehension. The forest, once a place of solitary retreat, had become a living, breathing entity, its pulse now synchronized with his own, its deepest mysteries forever entwined with his destiny. The quiet ranger, once broken by personal tragedy, had found healing and purpose in the most unexpected of friendships, becoming a silent guardian of a world few believed existed forever bound to the heart of the wild.